Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Today, we're really happy to launch one of the flagship products of the National Policies and Strategies Initiative of the CGIAR, the Political Economy and Policy Analysis Sourcebook, fondly known as PEPA. I'm Noreen Karachiwala, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm an economist and research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I lead a package of work on political economy and impact evaluation under the National Policies and Strategies Initiative. So a couple of housekeeping notes. Please keep your camera turned off to preserve bandwidth. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box Q&A function, and I'll ask your question during the Q&A period. And please also, when you ask the question, note who you would like the question addressed to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Clemens Breisinger, who is the program leader of the Kenya Strategy Support Program and a senior research fellow in the Development Strategies and Governance Unit at IFPRI. And he is the lead of the National Policies and Strategies Initiative. Clemens is a very active researcher, policy advocate, and and he's going to provide the opening remarks today. Over to you, Clemens.
All right, thank you, Noreen, for this nice introduction. Good afternoon from Kenya, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the launch of the Political Economy and Policy Analysis, or shortly PEPA Sourcebook today. It's my pleasure to kick this meeting off with a PEPA talk. And what I'm going to do is to emphasize why the PEPA Sourcebook developed under the CGIAR initiative on national policies and strategies is a really important and timely innovation. The National Policies and Strategies Initiative, or NPS in short, is designed to support partner governments in building policy coherence, sharing analytical tools and capacity like PEPA, for example, and co-creating demand-driven policy responses. As a result of NPS, the capacity shared and the evidence provided to decision makers is affecting lives of millions of people in Africa, Asia, and in Latin America. For NPS, as well as other efforts that aim at informing policymaking with evidence, be it by national think tanks or international organizations, understanding the political economy context is of paramount importance. It can greatly help the uptake of research-based recommendations by policymakers. The PEPA Sourcebook that we are launching today will help to disentangle and to analyze political economy contexts related to agri-food systems and beyond. PEPA brings together a collection of frameworks, analytical tools, and methods. It organizes political economy resources at multiple levels, at country and regional levels, at sector levels, at program level, and for cross-cutting issues as well. Collectively, the Sourcebook provides approaches to answering key questions relevant to inclusive agri-food system transformation, such as who are the influential actors driving policy processes and programs, what ideas, beliefs, and narratives shape crises and policy responses, what are the windows of opportunities for reform and policy change, what factors drive the effectiveness of policy implementation, and many more. PEPA comes at a critical time where government budgets are stretched to the limits and addressing unprecedented challenges require new out-of-the-box solutions. For example, governments are approaching MPS researchers with questions such as why domestic food prices remain stubbornly high despite lower world food prices, increases in fertilizer subsidies, and relatively good local harvests. The answer can often be found in incoherent policies where, in this case, the potential positive impact of fertilizer subsidies is offset by a simultaneous increase in fuel taxes and levies. PEPA will be very useful for unbundling and shedding more light on such policy incoherence. It will also enable policy analysts, students, policymakers, and development partners to explore policy solutions that address other structural weaknesses in the policy environment. Weaknesses that are often derailing efforts to transform food, land, and water systems and to achieve sustainable development goals. There are at least two important next steps for the National Policies and Strategies Initiative and its partners in 2024 and beyond. First is to scale up the co-creation of PEPA-based analysis in partner countries to improve policy coherence. And second, to integrate PEPA-based tools in national think tanks and as part of university curricula. I'm looking forward to this exciting and important agenda. Let me conclude by thanking all our national and international partners, all the CGIAR funders, and last but not least, Jonathan and Danielle and their team for putting this timely and innovative PEPA Sourcebook together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clemens. So now we'll move to the main event, the presentation of the PEPA Sourcebook. And this book is authored by Jonathan Mockshell, Danielle Resnick, Godfrey Alumo, Maria Blanco, and Alan Nicol. The two main authors, Jonathan and Danielle, will be presenting today. Jonathan is a research scientist, and senior agricultural economist at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, and he co-leads the work package 3 of the CGIAR initiative on national policies and strategies. His research focuses on agri-food system economics, political economy, and policy environments with a view to generating evidence-based insights for supporting agri-food systems transformation. His research and policy engagement work involves projects in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. His research before joining CIAT, he was a researcher at the now German Institute of Development and Sustainability and the University of Hohenheim. I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Noreen. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Michael, I'm wondering, can you please load the slides from your end?
Yeah, loading it.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Great. So thank you, Clemens, for that great introduction to our political economy analysis source book. And Michael, next slide, please. we know that agri-food systems is facing a number of critical challenges, and those challenges can be seen at the national level and also at the international level. The COVID crisis is one of them. And apart from that, we are living in an era where the post-COVID crisis is having multiple effects on food systems. We have other internal conflicts that is also aggravating some of the challenges we see within agri-food systems. Some of them are structural and others are governance related. All stakeholders, development partners, researchers, development practitioners are asking for a need to move away from the current food systems, evolve it to something that serves the needs of all stakeholders, including smallholder farmers. So the need to transition from the current food systems and move it to one that builds resilience within households are something that all stakeholders are promoting. And what we see currently is that there are a number of political economy factors and influences that we know that affects the success and often the failure of development interventions. And in most cases, what we see is a move to develop new technologies. And some of these new technologies are also having implications within farm households without the right political economy driver. We see that there is a number of enabling conditions also that are very important for food systems and political economy drivers, which is often neglected in the development of most interventions. And the need to have more evidence, solid evidence that will help reform the reform is something that we are calling for. And this should be a priority. Quite often, this question that comes to mind is what works where and why? Next slide, please. And this was other contested and policy-related questions within the food system. For example, what are the merits of agroecology versus sustainable agricultural intensification for climate mitigation and adaptation co-benefits? What institutional innovations are best fit for managing common pool natural resources to avoid conflicts and foster inclusion? What are the implications of a trickle-down program versus a bottom-up program in the governance and devolution structures of a digital innovation ecosystem? And finally, what are the factors driving the effectiveness of policy implementation following reform decisions? Next slide. So while we know that there are a number of ways to answer these questions, quite often what we see in the literature and also in development work is to provide a quick analysis. And in the literature, it focuses more on the rational choice approach based on classical economics. And what we see quite often neglected is the political economy and policy analysis lens. And some of the reasons is that there is fragmentation of the frameworks and methods and approaches. Some of the measurements are very vague without any key indicators that can be replicated, and also the lack of external validity. So there is a growing number of frameworks that we see that is aiming at solving this challenge. One of them is the TIPS, which is a source book from the World Bank, focusing mainly on operations. The second one is the political economy analysis in development policy operations. And then a more recent one, understanding political economy analysis and thinking and working politically. And finally, the kaleidoscope model of policy change. All these frameworks have given us a lot of information and has also helped to improve political economy analysis with regards to food systems. Next slide. However, what we see as a major problem or knowledge gap is that there is no source book that brings together frameworks, analytical tools, and case studies focusing on food, land, and water systems. In our pathway to contribute to solving this problem, we conducted a systematic review using the PRISMA approach, where we looked at an initial database of 1,200 And then within this database, based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria, we came out with over 60 different articles, which is spread across the different parts of the world. Next slide. And based on this analysis and putting the information together, we came out with the PEPA Sourcebook, Political Economy and Policy Analysis Sourcebook, PEPA for short. So the question is, what is PEPA? PEPA is a smart tool for answering policy questions critical for food systems transformation across food and nutrition, land and water, climate and ecology domains. What are the main features that PEPA brings on? So rather than having just individual frameworks or a source book which doesn't focus on food systems, in this context, food, land, and water, what PEPA brings together is frameworks, analytical tools, methods, case studies, step-by-step how-to guide, and an add-on which we call the PEPA micro simulation tool. So what is different about the PEPA compared to what we have already is a collection of these different features into one source book. Next slide. So let's take a deep dive into the main features, the frameworks, analytical tools across food, land, and water. Next slide. So first, based on our literature review and extensive analysis, we established a simple framework in order to be able to organize the vast majority of information that we have. So we classify this into 4 different dimensions. The first is to look into what we call the policy domains. And that policy domain looks at 3 different areas: food and nutrition, land and water, climate and ecology. The second level is to look into how this has been applied across different levels. And we classify this into macro, meso, micro, and multi. The third part is to look into what are the frameworks that align to each domain and each level. And then what are the tools that relate to the frameworks. So all the green boxes, what we see here, represents the frameworks, and then the orange represents the tools. So for example, if you look at a specific problem within the food and nutrition domain, one example of a framework is the advocacy coalition framework. If we look into the land and water, within the macro, for example, one framework is to look into institutional analysis and development. And within climate and ecology, one framework is to look at the kingdom's window of opportunity. And the related tool here is the multi-stakeholder influence mapping and power mapping tools. Next slide. So looking into the food and nutrition domain, when we move from the center, moving outward, we see the food and nutrition domain, the micro level tools and frameworks, the meso level food tools and framework, the macro level tools and framework, and the multi-level tools and framework. So for example, within the multi-level, a tool is the power mapping, and a framework is a kaleidoscope model of policy change. And then within the micro, we have the agent belief design intention model as a tool, and then a framework for recognizing diversity beyond capitalism. Next slide. So we didn't just stop at presenting those different frameworks, but rather providing an additional information with a description of each framework and how this framework has been used, and also the source for getting additional information about the framework. So the kaleidoscope model, for example, we have the description as having 16 different policy variables, and then the use is analyzing policy in multi-levels. And then we have the political settlement analysis tool, for example, framework, for example, and this, it focuses on underlining power arrangements in institutions, assesses political will to determine feasible policies, and involves 4 different steps. First, systematically mapping all key actors, identifying their interests, recognizing their forms of power in political, economy, and social and ideological, understanding the stakeholders' relationship, and finally, appreciating the issues, narratives, ideas. And my colleague Danielle, who would do the second presentation, will touch on this. Let's move to the next slide. So taking the kaleidoscope model of policy change as an example, and applying that to a case study of agricultural inputs subsidies and vitamin A fortification in Zambia. The main evidence that we synthesize and how that can apply to other analysis is that it provides core indicators and measurements that allow for replication. It has analytical tools for researchers and practitioners. It provides insight for policy engagement and also assesses when and where investment in policy reforms is most likely to have an impact. Next slide, please. So let's take the second example, climate and ecology policy domain. Within the climate and ecology policy domain, we have the same format moving from the middle part to outside, to the external. We have the micro level tools, the driver strategy outcome as a framework. And then within the macro level, we have tools such as process net map, discourse analysis, and then a framework such as biodiversity policy integration. Next slide. It also provides descriptions of all the different frameworks at the macro level, meso, and multi-level, and provides additional references and also how this can be used. So multiple streams framework, as a specific example, this, in terms of description, is a diagnostic framework, considers policy making as a series of steps. And there are 4 different steps here also: agenda setting, alternative specification, authoritative selection, and implementation. And the use is analyzing climate, policy integration, and also to enhance public policy making. And there are other frameworks such as the biodiversity policy integration and socio-ecological systems framework with their description and use. Next slide. So a specific case study here is the policy window of opportunity. The characteristics of this framework is that it has 3 different streams: the problem, the policy, and political streams, to create a window of opportunity when it all comes together. And it creates opportunity for reforms and policy change if these windows come together and a policy entrepreneur is able to push specific issues above the agenda setting. So the insights that can be drawn using this framework provides evidence that is relevant to achieve real change. And in this context, all actors must establish a political alliance or political alliances, build coalition, and gain credibility with decision makers in order for change to happen. Next slide. So what are the steps in applying the PEPA? 6 steps. Using ultra-processed food as a case study, for example, we start with the main problem, which is ultra-processed food, the prevalence of that. The second is questions of interest. So what are the reasons for the prevalence of ultra-processed food? Or why do we have so much ultra-processed food in the market? The third step is to select the frameworks, and based on those frameworks, go to data gathering, synthesize those results, and package the evidence. Next slide. So rather than just going ahead, what we want to do is to be able to provide a tool that helps this step. And so this tool is powered by AI at the background. And based on this, we have all the 6 different steps. So once you decide on the policy problem, you come with specific question, you decide on the framework and analytical tools, the data source, automatically you'll be able to receive some form of guidance that gives you how this tool can be used, or the framework, the type of analysis that can be conducted, and how to synthesize this. And this is going to be an add-on to our PEPA Sourcebook. Next slide. So bringing all this together, the PEPA Sourcebook is a smart tool for policy action. And what is different is that it brings together a collection of frameworks, analytical tools, methods, case study example, step-by-step how to guide, and an add-on, which is a micro simulation tool. And this will be very relevant for researchers, development practitioners, and policymakers to have a tool that is smart enough to be able to respond to policy demands to support policy decision-making. Next slide. So using this tool, we would want to thank all our supporters and colleagues who have helped us. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Danielle or myself. Over to you, Noreen.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was extremely interesting. I've watched with great interest. With that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Danielle Resnick is a senior research fellow at IFPRI's Washington, D.C. office in the Development Strategies and Governance Division. She's a political scientist whose research interest areas include political economy of agricultural development, decentralization, urban governance, informality, and democratization. And she has a regional specialization in sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining us at IFPRI, she held a 2-year fellowship at the Brookings Institute. Welcome back, Danielle. We're so happy to have you back, and I'll pass it on to you for your presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Noreen. And thanks so much to Jonathan for that great overview of the PEPA Sourcebook and really highlighting the niche that it's intended to fill. I'm going to talk briefly about one of the frameworks that Jonathan briefly alluded to. This is the political settlements framework. And I'll discuss how we've tried to apply it looking at value chain issues, specifically in the case of Kenya. And the intention is really to show how, the various frameworks and approaches that are in PEPA do not need to be used in isolation of each other or in isolation of economic and sociological frameworks. They can really be combined in novel and eclectic ways to provide a more holistic understanding of policy opportunities and bottlenecks. So this work I'm going to talk about today was supported by USAID. It was done in collaboration with Steve Hagblade and Isaac Minde at Michigan State University and Mercy Kamau at Tegemeo Institute in Kenya. So next slide, please, Michael. We were really motivated by a question that we were asked by USAID, which is really what are the key political economy bottlenecks that are hindering large-scale agricultural transformation in Kenya? The assumption was that Kenya has a lot of the right conditions, the right enabling environment in many respects for broad-based agricultural transformation. And yet we nonetheless see a lot of policy volatility and policy bottlenecks. And a suspicion that political economy dynamics were part of the reason for that. So we specifically looked at 3 value chains amongst the many that are important in Kenya. We looked at beef, sorghum, and fruits and vegetables. We chose those because those had been priority value chains under the Big Four agenda of the previous administration. We also chose them because they have been seeing growing domestic demand over recent years that cannot be met by domestic supply. So there's a real challenge for productivity amongst those value chains. At the same time, they have quite a bit of geographical variation in terms of where they're produced and a lot of variation in terms of their economic concentration. And so we were trying to understand, what political economy dynamics are specific to agricultural value chains and which are more cross-cutting and more specific to the broader political and institutional context in which value chain policies are being decided and implemented. We focused specifically on the 2013 to 2022 period because this was a period of major institutional changes in the country. As some of you may know, joining today, that was really the period of implementation of Kenya's constitutional reform, particularly the fourth schedule, devolving agriculture and also livestock responsibilities to the 47 county governments. So big institutional shift as well. In terms of methods, we used qualitative approaches. We started with 3 virtual focus groups with value chain experts, and then we had more than 40 semi-structured interviews on the ground in Kenya with governments, private sector, civil society, consumer group, and other types of stakeholders familiar with the 3 value chains. Next slide, please, Michael. So before going into some of the findings from the work, I want to take a step back and just highlight some key features of this political settlements framework. And I'm talking about it today because of all the many frameworks presented in the PEPA Sourcebook, this is probably the one that most predominantly falls within the political science discipline. And it really comes out of peace and security studies. And so it can show how, even a framework such as this can be used to offer some insights for food, land, and water system policies. It was really popularized by Mushtaq Khan at SOAS University, and it referring to the underlying distribution of decision-making power in a particular polity. It has two key dimensions to it. One is the horizontal settlement. This refers to the distribution of power across elite factions that are comprising a governing coalition. So when we think of elites, we can be thinking about presidents, prime ministers, governors, mayors, legislatures, military actors in some cases, or traditional leaders. The framework recognizes that these factions don't always have equivalent power. There's some who are in an inner circle, who are really the decision makers, and there's some that are more excluded. They're in the outer circle. And the relationship between these inner and outer factions has really important implications for policy stability or volatility more broadly. In addition, there's a vertical dimension to the political settlement, and the vertical settlement is looking to the way in which different societal groups, whether farmers associations, trade unions, women's groups, how they're incorporated and managed by different elites. And that the way that they're incorporated often depends on what's called their disruptive potential, the way in which they can push forward to have their different claims on policy issues heard, and how broadly based they are, how concentrated they are, and their disruptive potential really influences the way in which elites react. Do they try to co-opt them and give them some certain policy concessions? Do they try to repress them? Or do they even marginalize them? They're not really very vocal or have much power, and so therefore they're ignored. So we take this component of the political settlements framework and we layer it onto other different frameworks that are appropriate for better understanding value chain decisions. Next slide, please, Michael. So you can see kind of highlighted in red towards the right-hand side of this diagram is where we've kind of superimposed these dimensions of the political settlement, both the horizontal settlement and the vertical political settlement. And we start first with traditional thinking about value chains and looking at the various actors in the value chains and assessing their distribution of power themselves, who has marketing power between producers, traders, processors, retailers, exporters, and consumers. And what power do they have within the vertical political settlement? That may be determined through, how broad-based they are. This may be their importance for votes. It may be in terms of, company contributions to political parties, and maybe because there's a close overlap between political and business elites in a particular agricultural value chain. But we also recognize from collective action theory and organizational theory that lobbying bodies also make a really big influence in terms of how and when voices are heard. So we look at kind of, how confederated different unions may be. They're resource-based themselves. Can they afford per diems to take MPs, out for lunches to advocate their policy decisions? And then we also look at a lot of public administration and bureaucratic theory in terms of looking at the degree of conflict or cooperation within bureaucratic ministries, agencies, and even subnational departments that typically provide oversight and monitoring and evaluation of policy implementation. We also know from some of the thinking about embedded autonomy of bureaucracies that in certain cases, particularly when there is fractionalization within the horizontal political settlement, that can affect political interference in the bureaucracy and affect policy implementation. So this is the broader way in which we have been able to layer different types of frameworks talked about in PEPA. Next slide, please. I certainly don't have time today to go into the findings of those different dimensions for the three value chains I talked about. I'll just briefly note with respect to beef some of the key takeaway messages that we have in our broader paper. One is, looking within the beef value chain in Kenya, there's a lot of actors involved. They're very fragmented and very low levels of trust with each other. We found that the concentration of market power in terms of information and influencing prices is really coming from brokers, wholesalers, and ranchers in particular, who are much more export oriented. Lobbying efforts have been relatively uncoordinated. There are several different bodies that represent livestock interests, but they're relatively uncoordinated. Many of the issues that they're concerned about that have been embedded in different parliamentary bills, like the livestock marketing bill, have frequently stalled. Political leverage varies dramatically amongst the actors in the value chain. It's very high for ranchers because there is actually a very high overlap between politicians and ranchers. It's very low for pastoralists, who you might have noticed from my first screen actually comprise the largest share of production for the livestock sector, but nonetheless have very low marketing information and are quite weak in terms of political leverage. There's been a number of issues within the bureaucracy in recent years in terms of oversight and implementation of livestock and beef policy. Most notably, there has been a bit of a contentious decision under the previous administration to move authority for the Kenya Meat Commission to the military under the Kenya Defense Forces. There's also been contention between ministries of agriculture and health over where does food safety for livestock actually sit. And then across all three of these value chains, the horizontal political settlement has really affected decision-making. One thing that was noted quite often was fractionalization among the elites after the Building Bridges initiative. That led to a lot of tension, both within ministries and across MPs, and led to a lot of the stalling of parliamentary decision-making. Also, through devolution, we saw growing political power of the governors, the 47 governors, who each decided to charge their own agricultural cess rate as produce was moved from the farm to markets, and that created a lot of inefficiencies within the different value chains. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, this slide is just intended to show the broader value of embedding a political lens into policy recommendations. We have a very lengthy list of this in our policy paper, but the main takeaway here is that we're offering policy recommendations, but then what you see highlighted in the red box is also thinking about the political feasibility of those policy recommendations. That's highlighted in the political feasibility column, and then thinking about what interventions are actually needed to improve that political feasibility so that those policy recommendations can actually be implemented. And I think this is the broader contribution that we can think about with PEPA and other types of frameworks, is that we're not just looking at the technical costs and benefits, but what's kind of the best fit given the underlying political and institutional context. Last slide, please, Michael. If you want to know more about this work, there's a lot more detail I can't go into today, but please feel free to reach out, and you can also download the paper at the website you see here. Let me turn back to you, Noreen. Thank you.
Danielle, thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed it. We're now going to have some remarks from Marcela Quintero, who is a Senior Director of Food Systems and Transformation Science Group of the CGIAR, and she's the Associate Director General, Research Strategy and Innovation for the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. She's an ecologist at the Universidad Naviera in Colombia and holds a PhD from the Department of Agronomy at the University of Florida. She has occupied several leadership positions as the Ecosystem Services Theme Leader and Agrosystems and Sustainable Landscapes Research Director at CIAT. Most recently as the multi-fund of the CGIAR Agroecology Initiative. Remember everyone that you can type your questions into the Q&A function, which can add the chat bubbles icon.
Okay, can you hear me well now?
Over to you, Marcela.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. No, thank you very much. And thanks also for the presentation from Jonathan and Danielle. And I think it's this PEPA Sourcebook is very timely, and let's remember what is at stake. So, I mean, right now, agriculture is in the middle of a big puzzle that we need to work on to try to kind of see how in agriculture and our efforts there can help us to make progress on reducing food insecurity and also in reducing the impact of agriculture in the planet. So basically what we know is that from we have kind of erased the progress that we made when we were reducing people insecurity, food insecurity. So right now we have 180 million more people facing severe food insecurity than in 2019. So there is a lot of extent right now. And so it means agriculture, as I said, is in the middle of that puzzle, but it's a dynamic puzzle. So when we try to see how we make agriculture a sector that is sustainable, but also that fits the world, it means that it's not only about technologies, but it's also about, as was pointed out by Jonathan and Daniel, that it's about actors, it's about coalitions, it's about ideas and networks that at the end contribute to shape our current food systems. So it means that now we need to rethink those visions, those food systems, kind of developing common visions across different actors and in the different countries. So I think this PEPA Sourcebook is extremely useful, providing us frameworks, analytical tools, and case studies to help us think, okay, how we bring all those different pieces together, the actors, the coalitions, the networks, the information, to understand what are those windows of opportunities that we as researchers, but also with our partners that are from development partners, practitioners, and etc., those windows of opportunities that we have to make those changes in the food systems in the countries. So I really want to emphasize the added value of this PEPA Sourcebook in that sense. And I think it's also very timely, and now talking more from the perspective of the CGIAR, because in the CGIAR, we are committed to do system transformation, food system transformation. But then I was talking with Jonathan, and he was reminding me that proverb of Africa that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And it also means also in the way we are seeing innovations in the food system. So if we want to transform food systems only with the delivery of technologies alone, probably we are going to go fast, but not very far. So it really needs to be combined with understanding what are the political economy drivers and the social implications of policies and program implementation at the national and local government levels. And talking about national and local levels, I really like this application that Daniel just presented, because it's also at the national and local level where that transformation occurs, where it's more tangible, and also where we can measure if we are really contributing to sustaining the planet, if we are also reducing food insecurity, and also if we are making also our poor people more have a better livelihoods. So and in that sense, I would like also to congratulate the National and Policies Strategy Initiative, because it's really that focus and that level of intervention that is looking at is that transformation at the national and local levels. The other thing I want to highlight is something that Jonathan said regarding, the bottom-up approaches. And for example, and you mentioned it, agroecology, Jonathan, as well. And in agroecology, we also talk about, improving the agency of farmers and local actors when we are talking about solutions to transform positively their systems. And if this PEPA Sourcebook and the frameworks, the analytical tools that it contains can help us to support this, I think is going to be super important, because farmers alone cannot make the change, but if we help to understand what are those political drivers that are behind, for example, extension service in a country, and how probably we can work together with those other actors to deliver effective extension services to those farmers, and then those extension services, vice versa, also collect the needs of the farmers, then I think we are making progress. So I think for the CGIAR, it's extremely important to start thinking on this, on political economy, what are the drivers, what are the determinants, what are the different interests of the different actors, and if we have better sources to understand and tools to understand how those interests come together and how we can support the development of common visions of food systems at the national and local level, I think that's already a good progress for us as researchers that work for development and also on increasing the sustainability of our food systems. So with this, I don't want to take more of the time here. I also actually would like to pass the floor to you back, because in the next panel, we are going to have the opportunity to listen on concrete examples of doing policy analysis and political economy analysis on specific countries and at that scale. So with this, again, I congratulate the initiative and also Jonathan and Daniel for this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. And you've just done part of my job in introducing the panel. So I'm just going to introduce all of the panel members. So first we have Antonia Sindine, who is a professor of political science and international relations. And she is the first female director general of the Nigeria Institute of Social and Economic Research. We applaud her for that. Her research interests include public sector government, politics and elections in Nigeria, gender issues, and socioeconomic development and good governance. Next, we will have Jamie Morrison, who is the Senior Advisor of Policy and External Relationships at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which is GAIN. He brings more than 25 years of experience in the provision of research, capacity development, and technical assistance on the impact of trade and economic policy on processes of agricultural development and food systems transformation. We will next hear from Marco Sanchez Cantillo, who is the Deputy Director of the Agri-Food Economics Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, where he leads the team that produces the flagship report, The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. He also conducts quantitative policy research and analysis. Finally, we'll hear from Binyam Eyoub, who is a senior policy advisor at the Feed the Future Office of Policy Analysis and Engagement, Bureau for Resilience, Environment and Food Security at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Over to you, Antonia.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you very much. I want to apologize that I did not succeed to share my short presentation with the team. I have actually been on the move in the last 10 days or so. So I'll just read what I have, but I have a presentation which I can share with Jonathan later. So ours is about case studies. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. So, and I'm going to be talking about the Nigerian policy environment. Say first that ours is one that is fraught with several challenges that make the execution and continuity of development policies often difficult. And one of those challenges is that there's a big disconnect between evidence and policy making in Nigeria. One finds that irrespective of the fact that evidence comes forth through scientific process and oftentimes may be credible, it will not always inform policy because of political expediencies. Consequently, the political economy factors need to be taken into account in analyzing evidence in order to inform policy and decision making. Political economy factors to consider would include structural and foundational factors, such as historical antecedents and cultural strongholds in the Nigerian context. It's such a diverse nation. Some of the things you can do in some parts, you may not be able to do in some parts. So you can't have, for instance, a one-size-fits-all agricultural policy. The other institutions, formal and informal rules that guide actions and decision-making. And a third factor for me will be incentives and how these affect the positioning of stakeholders in the policies space. Political economy factors are critical in analyzing the feasibilities for policy implementation and reform. So the way we apply PEPA to the Nigerian policy environment is to integrate the approach into research and data analysis. By this, the results and the accompanying recommendations that emerge from research will most likely be politically smart and more likely to be useful in the policy space. As Jonathan and his colleagues have pointed out, when PE factors are ignored in policy analysis, development outcomes will be slow in coming. We have classic examples in the oil and gas industry, as well as in the electricity value chain in Nigeria. These were sectors that illustrated how strong vested interests could influence the way institutions are structured and could constitute strong roadblocks to change and policy reform. So even when the evidence from research points to a particular solution, cultivating pathways to the solution point can be very tedious and frustrating. A success story, though short-lived, during the agricultural transformation agenda was when the fertilizer subsidy program seemed to have achieved a wide reach across farmers. However, some strong interest groups had to be circumvented, while the rules of access were also modified to favor target beneficiaries directly. The success could not be sustained, however, once the change champion, the then Minister of Agriculture, left the scene. This is one of the reality that we need to deal with in Nigeria's development space. I think that PEPA can help us to uncover the non-obvious factors that are often at play beneath the surface of things. In terms of how PEPA can be applied to policy making, I think that we need to have a handshake between researchers, policy analysts, and policymakers. As long as these groups are working in silos, insights drawn from PEPA may not be used to inform policy. On our part at NISA, the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, we have attempted to reach out to other groups using policy dialogue and policy engagement platforms. And we are still keeping up this effort with the hope that it yields desirable outcomes. Trust building between these groups is critical for progress. Also, we have, because we conduct evidence-based policy analysis on different aspects of socio-economic issues, I guess that is it for me to stop.
Yes, why don't you finish your sentence though?
Okay, I had a concrete example. There was a Ruga initiative, which was meant to, to help address the problem of incessant farmer-herder clashes in Nigeria. It was meant to see the creation of reserved communities in all states. However, the way the program was designed was a clear case of focusing on solution rather than addressing the problem. People saw it as a way to give land to particular ethnic and religious groups, and so forth. The states that make up the federation did not buy into it because of the Land Use Act that has vested interest and all of that. So we see potential for PEPA in addressing issues of development, especially agricultural development base. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antonia. We'll next move on to Jamie Morrison. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Noreen, and hello to everybody. So first of all, many congratulations to the authors of this source book, which I think is not only a very helpful collection of approaches for analysing the policy context and for identifying potential bottlenecks to policy change, but by demonstrating how they can be applied, should also help us to amplify the importance of actually using these approaches. And I think that's a big gap. As the source book demonstrates, there are many different frameworks, approaches available, but we're not really seeing them applied to the extent that they need to be. So again, we're in the early stages of implementing a 5-year multi-donor funded project called Nourishing Food Pathways. And this is supporting governments in 11 countries across Africa and Asia to take forward processes of food system transformation. And we use the food systems pathways developed in the run-up to the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 as a basis for that engagement. We have policy advisors who are working very closely with their national conveners and associated governance structures to try to identify policy gaps and areas of policy misalignment that are constraining impactful food system transformation, and to help to strengthen the decision-making processes in a way that a food system approach can be effectively adopted instead of just talked about. So we've worked over the past few months with our policy advisors and with great support from Daniel Resnick to help them to start to identify the potential political economy strengths to strengthening these decision-making processes. And as the next stage, the work will scope out some of the viable options to help policy advisors and governments that they're supporting to navigate these potential bottlenecks. And I believe that the source book will provide a very valuable resource in that regard. In terms of what we're finding in relation to policy engagement around food system transformation, one question that we keep being asked, particularly by ministries of agriculture, is in advocating for a food system approach, what is the difference between agricultural transformation and food system transformation? Ministries of agriculture who are asking the question have often traditionally been mandated to take forward processes of agricultural transformation, but now they're being asked to steward the food system transformation process. And that's a significant change. And I think there's still a lot of questions that political economy analysis can help us think through in terms of providing guidance to governments in that respect. In a recent blog, Lawrence Haddad and I tried to explain the difference between agricultural transformation and food system transformation and why that matters. And there were a number of aspects which point to the importance of better understanding political economy issues. I think, the first is that processes of food system transformation require coordinated action and investment of multiple actors if food systems are to deliver multiple outcomes. And this throws up a large number of questions that could be informed by the approaches detailed in the source book. For example, how can coordinated action best be incentivized? How can policy coherence be improved where the outcomes of those policies fall under the mandates of multiple ministries? What support is required to overcome constraints, including reducing fragmentation and improving horizontal coordination between sectors? And I think really importantly in the context of food system transformation, how can subnational levels of government be better linked to the national policy making processes? A second point that comes through quite strongly, I think, is decisions around the sequencing of interventions, which becomes much more acute when we're looking at food system transformation as opposed to simply agricultural transformation. And it reminded me of some work that I did with a colleague, Andrew Dorwood, for FAO about 25 years ago now, where we argued that success in agricultural transformation had been characterized by the sequential alleviation of constraints that were holding back productivity improvements. But what we find with food system transformation is that we need to look at prioritization of action across many different sectors, which each have a different levels of influence in political and budget allocation process, making that issue of thinking through sequencing of policy as a way of navigating bottlenecks much more difficult. And then just one final point, I realize I've heard my chime. Related to the above, budget allocation mechanisms will need to change if resources are to follow priorities. And at present, we know very little about how budgets are actually being allocated to achieve different food systems outcome, making it difficult to advocate for that change. And I think this is something that we hope to shed light on working with IFAD and the World Bank as we try to map out public, ODA and private sector allocations to food systems. So thank you. Back to you, Noreen.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We're now going to move over to Marco. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to provide some thoughts about the PEPA Sourcebook. First of all, of course, I join my co-panelists in congratulating the authors of this report. I think when I looked at it, I was really getting more and more interested in the way granularly the source book gets into the key issues. And at the end of the day, one of the conclusions that make up in my mind was, how accounting for political economy analysis is a great opportunity for all of us to improve scientific knowledge acceptance. So particularly in the case of people like me that work on quantitative analysis, this is an excellent opportunity to, do things right and account for the political economy that help us understand a few issues. And let me reflect a bit about how the insights from this PEPA Sourcebook, in my view, can help us guide policy processes. A key contribution, in my view, of the Sourcebook is the guide to analysis resources by following the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, the PRISMA 2020 statement, as well as the different frameworks that are identified. In my view, using this type of reviews and also some of the suggested frameworks can be critical for policy analysts to identify countries' development priorities while considering the political economy, and also to use this information to feed up into rigorous quantitative analysis that will inform decision-making. The identified countries' development priorities could, of course, help policy analysts to present themselves better prepared for a conversation with decision makers with whom they could validate their prior knowledge on priorities. And this knowledge is key for quantitative analysis. In FAO, for example, we are using a policy optimization modeling tool by which we are helping countries in sub-Saharan Africa to optimize their budgets in agriculture, specifically to achieve several inclusive agricultural transformation objectives, namely increasing agri-food GDP, increasing jobs of the farm in rural areas, reducing rural poverty, reducing the cost of healthy diets, and many others. And in this tool, these objectives can be weighted to reflect prioritization. And we define these weights by establishing a dialogue with policymakers and keeping in mind the political economy. But we are aware that this conversation may not always be possible. So when this is the case, the type of systematic reviews and the frameworks presented in the PEPA Sourcebook can come very handy to identify priorities before generating the quantitative evidence that will inform decision-making. Now, what are some of the FAO experiences on using PEPA evidence and policy engagement? Let me share some of these experiences in the framework of the FAO's Monitoring and Analyzing Food and Agricultural Policies Program, MAFAP, which relate to the PEPA type of evidence and work. One objective of the MAFAP program is to generate evidence that is persuasive enough to trigger policy reforms at country level. And for this to happen, of course, the MAFAC team applies informally many of the concepts referenced in the PEPA Sourcebook. For example, identifying policy problems and focusing events, mapping influential actors, understanding their values, beliefs, and narratives to seize windows of opportunity to shape reforms with relevant technical work. And this has allowed us to score more than 30 reforms at country level in sub-Saharan African countries. The PEPA Sourcebook will help us, structure a little bit how we approach these attempts to reform policies at country level. But some of our technical work as well can also provide valuable information for PEPA. For example, the MAFAC public expenditure data that we have disaggregate budgetary transfers, identifying those going to public goods and services, for example, research, extension, and those going to private goods and services, for example, inputs. And this helps us understand how interest groups benefit from targeted transfers of public resources in agriculture, for example, farmers, which can support PEPA. Likewise, the MAFAC team also analyzes price incentives, which helps understand if trade and marketing policies adopted by governments support food producers at the expense of consumers or vice versa. I believe that unveiling which actors in agri-food systems are being incentivized versus those that are not can be an essential aspect of any PEPA on food and agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marco. We're finally going to hear from Binyam Eyoub, who is a senior policy advisor at the Feed the Future Office of Policy Analysis and Engagement, as a reminder. Over to you, Binyam.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share some insights into how this book on political economy and policy analysis reflects many of USAID's strategic priorities on climate, food security, water, gender equity, and more. I'll frame my remarks for today in three parts. First, the themes addressed in this source book align very well with the three broad objectives of the US government's global food security strategies, or Feed the Future's three broad objectives, which are A, inclusive and sustainable agricultural-led economic growth, B, strengthen resilience among people and systems, and C, well-nourished population, especially among children, among women and children. In particular, this book complements the Global Food Security Strategies Cross-Cutting Intermediate Result 7 on more effective governance, policy, and institutions. Additionally, this source book complements the strategy's 22 activity guidances, especially the programming approach for policy system strengthening. Second, similar to the Kenya's agricultural value chain that Dr. Resnick highlighted, USAID has funded political economy and policy analysis related activities that I would like to share with you three examples about. The first example, A is about USAID Nepal funded the Feed the Future Policy Reform Initiative that ended in 2018. A number of policy-related assessments and studies were produced. Recommendations from these assessments have helped stakeholders understand the context and role of the agricultural sector to the government of Nepal, private sector, and USAID. The project has helped USAID in designing new activities. B, through funding from USAID Sudan, IFPRI recently submitted reports such as on the political economy of wheat and on the architecture of the Sudanese agricultural sector and its contribution to the economy. These reports were useful in informing decisions and programming, in disseminating publications to stakeholders in the country, and highlighting specific activities such as on the nitrogen oxide emissions at the onset of the current conflict in the country and the economic-wide analysis of the conflict, demonstrating the challenges, especially on its food security trajectory. Third, I'd like to provide a brief summation of 4 examples on how this source book can potentially help us. A, it provides evidence analysis, such as the steps in conducting PEPA on the book that are useful into policymakers tasked with making decisions regarding investments, such as on research and development and extension services, which are critical in achieving sustainable development. B, it provides a framework on climate that can help to inform our new activities, such as the Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative, CACI, that focuses on nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans. C, it provides comparative case studies that may be helpful in assessing pathways to scaling to other countries' successes, such as a nutrition-sensitive irrigation guidance that was provided by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation and IFPRI to the World Bank, which used it in Mali based on policy and national context priorities. And D, it provides evidence on the role of financial support from national governments to local service providers. For example, on scale-appropriate mechanization services, as reported extensively by one of the USAID-funded projects, such as the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia, which is called CISA in short. I'd like to end my comment by saying that this is an important source book. A careful reading of its contents provides numerous details that will be appreciated by all of us. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Binyam. We'll now have a presentation from Alan Nicol, who is the Principal Researcher in Governance and Inclusion at the International Water Management Institute, and he is also the co-lead for our initiative, National Policies and Strategies. His research is focused on water and development in Asia, with a particular focus on political economy, rural water development, and transboundary river basin management. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you so much, Noreen. It's great to be here, and I really want to celebrate really the production and launch of this PEPA Sourcebook. It's interesting because back in the early 90s, we worked on political economy tools at SOAS when I was doing my PhD, and we were unpicking some of the knotty conundrums surrounding water policy in the Middle East, such as why have countries not gone into conflict over access to water when there's so much demand and such a little amount of the resource available. And we unpicked those ideas, those wicked problems, and identified a range of solutions, including the import of food, and therefore the import of virtual water. So we were using tools in the water sector of political economy analysis all those decades ago. But it's very important to continue to bring these tools together and to provide a really coherent set of analytical approaches in the water sector, in the food sector, and in the land sector across these systems, because those are systems under constant pressure. And what we found, particularly in the water world in recent years, is the enormous disruption being caused by climate change on the water systems, creating impacts on food systems, impacts on energy systems that we hadn't anticipated. These require really deep understanding of the interests at work, the kinds of power and resources that authors like Mark Reisner and Cadillac Desert so many years ago said water flows uphill to money and power. Understanding how those interests have affected allocation of water, have affected pricing of water, and ultimately have affected availability of water in particular transboundary contexts. So the political economy tools that the PEPA Sourcebook can bring to this range of challenges that affect all regions of the world, but particularly areas where there's great water scarcity, is so important. What I like to say is also that the mapping of policy and understanding the landscape of policy out there is part of the National Policies and Strategies Initiative, and really trying to bring together in that analysis how policies develop, the origin stories, if you like, of policies is critically important. The kind of institutional landscape and analysis we're conducting will be enormously enriched by this PEPA Sourcebook, because it brings together so much of the fragmented information out there, so many of the approaches that in some ways, I think, as Danielle said, are quite often scattered. And one of the things we're trying to do under NPS and across the CGIAR, and of course more broadly with our partners in the different countries we're working in, is to ensure that we can strengthen those approaches over time, including sharing important lessons of our work with partners in different countries, understanding how those policy contexts, whether it's in Nigeria or Egypt or India or Laos, how those policy contexts shape policy processes and policy outcomes, and ultimately what kind of policy flux is there? How often and why do policies change? You know, what kinds of systemic changes? You've heard about the change in administration in Kenya that Daniel mentioned. How have those systemic changes triggered policy changes, and why are they significant, particularly as we face real challenges of climate resilience and climate adaptation? So for me, it's particularly exciting to see this source book launched. It's really also important to maybe focus on that issue, that core issue of political feasibility, because quite often in my career, doing political economy analysis always poses a question, the so what question. We know those interests are there. We know there are hidden interests as well as revealed interests at work in policy processes. It's complex, it's difficult terrain, and it involves power resources. The so what question is, what do we do with that analysis? And I think that whole question of political feasibility, unblocking challenges to policy implementation, supporting more equitable policy engagement, creating policies that are perhaps more focused on those most in need, the most vulnerable, are really critical criteria and areas that we want to apply this source book to. So I think that the PEPA, the book is there, the source book is there, the range of materials that we need are there. It's all about the implementation now. And I think those last two comments, those last two speakers have really hit the nail on the head. Bringing this into the work of agencies and governments and other partners in civil society is really critical now. And I look forward to helping to do that. And I'm sure it'll be a very fruitful period of research for development ahead, driven by the PEPA Sourcebook. Thank you. Noreen, back to you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Much appreciated. So we're now going to take questions from the audience. So remember to type your message into the chat box and I'll direct your message to the appropriate speaker. And in that vein, please note which speaker you'd like to direct the question to. So we have one question right now for Antonia. And the question is from Francois Stepman. How can political economy and overcoming some barriers be reflected in the biannual CAADP progress reports? I actually don't know what CAADP means. So Antonia, if you could give us that acronym before you answer. Thank you.
It's the CAADP, AU CAADP programs.
Okay, I also don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I also don't know the acronym, but somebody was trying to explain.
It's the CAADP program of the African Union, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Danielle. And please, all the speakers, feel free to turn your cameras back on.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, so I'll just say that what would apply to the Nigerian situation is the same thing that we can use for other African countries and the African Union in general. And the general point is that it is important that before policies are made, I think PEPA allows us to examine situations in which we can say what can work, not what is good to work. We must examine the circumstance, the environment of each place, each country, each situation before we try to maybe dump, in quotes, the new policy that is going to be implemented. It shouldn't be about what is good. It should be more about what can work, taking the environment into consideration. And I think that as long as the utility of PEPA is in adopting this kind of approach, what is the situation there? What are the relationships? What are the interests and all of that can affect any policy that is going to be implemented? And once this is done, it might be we might have a bit more success in what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. And I actually could not agree more. The next question is for Danielle. So not all dimensions of political economy are welcomed by policymakers. Are there certain political economy issues that get more receptivity by policymakers than others?
Yeah, I think from my experience, issues that are more focused on how the public administration works get a little bit more receptivity than other questions. If you talk about, subsidies are being used for, maybe vote buying, that's not going to get much traction or reform. But if you talk about some of the incentive structures within maybe the public sector that are inhibiting reform, or perhaps, creating frictions amongst different ministries, that tends to get a little bit more traction, because it is a little bit more on the technical governance side than the kind of hardcore political side. And in those cases, what's often useful to do is, as Alan was noting, as well as taking examples from other contexts, that's often welcome. So saying, country X also was facing this political economy issue within the public administration. They tackled it by doing X, Y, and Z. And it gives a feeling that this is not something specific of this country. Policymakers don't feel targeted in any sense. And it gives a sense of learning of what works and what doesn't work. And that was actually the case that we did in Nepal that Biniam alluded to when we were looking at reform of the agricultural sector in the wake of their constitutional reforms from a unitary to a federal structure. We kind of focused on what are kind of the institutional political economy issues that might emerge, and took some lessons learned from other cases, including Kenya, to help inform the Nepali government.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is an issue that I've often wondered about myself. The next question is for Jonathan. So you talked about the micro simulation toolbook. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Noreen. So that's an add-on to the PEPA Sourcebook. So basically what we've done with the micro simulation tool, it's still in the design phase, but currently it's built on the 6 steps of PEPA in terms of how to conduct PEPA analysis. And basically the idea of this is to be able to reduce the amount of time that we spend, not ruling out that researchers and development partners and sometimes our stakeholders need quick information with regards to a certain policy and wants to make a decision. So based on this, the idea is to have an alternative to the mainstream type of analysis we'll do, which sometimes could take a couple of weeks or months to do, and reduce this to days. And in this case, you'll be able to feed in a specific research problem, come out with a specific question. Based on that question, you'll be able to look for which frameworks will fit to answering that question. And then you are given a step-by-step guide with regards to first, how you can apply the framework, how you can apply the analytical tool, and then which type of the data you need to synthesize and how to package that policy decision making. So there is an AI algorithm behind it, and the idea is to be able to train this further with both secondary and data sources. So I would say it's something interesting and would really help to change how we conduct paper analysis, and particularly responding to policy decision in a very quick fashion.
Wow, that is incredibly helpful, that tool. And I'll say right now, I plan to use it in my impact evaluation work. So thank you for producing this additional, really valuable resource. The next question is for Jamie. How can subnational levels of government be linked through food systems processes? Do we still have Jamie online?
Jamie has left.
Oh, okay. Well, on to the next question. Oh, you can't unmute. Oh, Michael, do you have any ideas? You're the tech whiz.
Okay, did that work now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I got a message saying cannot unmute yourself. But it seems I am. I guess the camera might be working as well.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, yeah, so I think, yeah, in relation to can some of these insights be used at the more global level? I think, yeah, we do see very similar political economy constraints to improve coherence across global agreements, but also in their translation from the global level down to the national level. So if you think about global agreements, I mean, essentially they create a framework within which governments can design and implement policy. And what we're seeing is that in many of the cases, the existing frameworks, take, for example, the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, reflect a state of the global economy, which is quite different to where we find ourselves today. So there is an urgent need, particularly with this focus on food system transformation and the trade-offs that it throws up between different sectors, both to renegotiate these agreements, but also to ensure that they're much more coherent across agriculture, nutrition, health, environment, climate, labor, etc. But as we've seen, and that's also reflected at the national level, negotiations reflect vested interests and existing power relationships within rule-setting institutions. And it's proved to be very difficult and in many cases impossible, again, look at the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, to foster significant reforms in these agreements that deliver real change. And I think, it's that understanding of vested interest, existing power relations, and how they work really needs to be unpicked in order to effectively support the renegotiation of a number of these different global agreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. That's really interesting to hear. It's not an not an easy task. So the next question is for Jonathan. There are actually two. So one is for Jonathan, one is for Jonathan and Danielle. So we'll make this quick. So Jonathan, how can we include some policy actors into the policy analysis so that there's ownership in the transformation?
No, definitely. For policy analysis, we cannot ignore the policy actors. They need to be key stakeholders. And quite often, in terms of policy analysis and policy processes, the analysis is with the policy actors who are engaged in everyday policy making. So, for example, if it's with the Ministry of Agriculture in Nigeria, we go and work with these key actors who are involved in the policy process. So, by interviewing them, by understanding the conditions that are important, then we are able to provide the policy options that are important for the policy processes throughout the policy processes.
Great, thank you. That was insightful. So Francois actually has another question, and this is for both you and Danielle. How does PEPA help set scenarios for priority setting in agricultural investments?
Well, I can start first. I think in terms of it's not really going to be able to set the priority for the investment. I think it can help contextualize whether that priority is going to be politically feasible. So that's when I was alluding to some of the work that we've been doing, thinking about we have kind of our first best option in terms of this priority is going to generate the greatest poverty reduction, the greatest job creation, the greatest growth, et cetera. but it's may never be implemented, and therefore it's not worthwhile. So it's kind of it's not going to be, for that type of question, it's not going to be in the driving seat. It's going to be a complementary tool in terms of saying, given what we think from a cost benefit approach about prioritization, investments in this area are going to be key. What do we need to then have on the political and the institutional side in order to actually realize those investments? So it's thinking about how do you either calibrate to the existing political economy context, or how do you catalyze the political economy context in order to get to those first priorities that you want to get. And we need to decide where we want to invest the time, if we want to contextualize to what we have, or if we want to actually make those complementary investments in public sector reforms as well, to make those priorities occur and meaningful.
Okay, thank you so much. To me, this is a really important question, so I'm going to take the chair's advantage and just ask one more question. And this question is for Marco. Marco, do you see the PEPA joining with the FAO country level processes? And very briefly, and then I'll close. Thank you.
Why not? Why not? Actually, it shows that there is a lot to learn out there, right? That we are not considering, but our tools have a space to consider. So in prioritizing, for example, agricultural transformation objectives, which are many, there is a lot of political economy behind how to prioritize them. How to have the conversation with the policymakers is something that we could structure very well if we follow the PEPA Sourcebook approaches, right? So I'm definitely answering very easily. Yes, of course, I'm here to collaborate with the authors and look forward to hearing from them on this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marco. So this has been a very exciting seminar, and I'm really happy to see that all of our speakers are very excited about the PEPA Sourcebook and indeed plan to use it. As we close, I have a lot of thank yous, but we'll keep them brief. So first, I'd like to thank Jonathan and Danielle and their co-authors, our panelists for the thought-provoking remarks and for sharing your insights and experiences, and to Michael Go and Joanna Cruz for their help today. We would also especially like to thank, of course, the CGIAR funders that support the National Policies and Strategies Initiative. So the next steps here are to, one, scale up the co-creation of PEPA-based analysis in partner countries to improve policy coherence, and two, to integrate the PEPA-based tools in the national think tanks and as part of university curricula, which is a very exciting development. Finally, thank you everyone for joining us and for the lively discussion. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day or evening, as the case may be. Thank you so much, everyone.